As a light-skinned Black woman, Yvonne Austin never fit fully in either culture, yet it catapulted her to invest her 20 years' experience in diversity, equity, and inclusion. She now helps organizations to leave an indelible impression on their workforce and society. As Yvonne says, we are at our best when all voices are heard and valued, and when everyone has the opportunity to contribute their diverse perspective and talents to the mission at hand.
The topic we have today couldn't be more timely, could it? DEI. What is DEI? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you know, it's interesting. I put on our first speaker that we had was a Black lady. She and I both won a Purpose Prize. We're very friends, and we were chatting. That's of course when all the news was about George Floyd, and she called me white supremacist. She says, "You're a white supremacist." No, you're, what did she call me? And I bristled. And I said, "I am not." She said, "You are." She said, "You have no idea what it's like to walk in my shoes and what I had to go through. Even when I walk into a store, people look at me differently, like, how can I afford to be in this store?" So this whole topic of diversity right now is one of the top 4 topics that is being discussed in business and industry today, DEI. And we are really fortunate to have Yvonne Austin with us today. And she says her passion and purpose are to help both profit and nonprofit organizations leave their indelible impression, which is the name of her company, Indelible Impressions, on the workplace and society. She believes that being inclusive and creating a culture of belonging brings out the best in individuals. It boosts innovation, increases team, community, cohesion, productivity, and ultimately strengthens an organization's workforce and bottom line. To aid organizations in messaging their DEI and core values and mission, Yvonne helps develop and amplify the soul of their brand. I'm going to be anxious to know how you develop the soul of a brand. The goal is to help drive awareness with targeted messaging that resonates and creates authentic connections with audiences to make and leave an enduring impression. As a Black woman, Yvonne has experienced and understands firsthand the impact of workplace and community racism, misogyny, and bigotry. With over 20 years experience working with organizations to identify gaps and opportunities, Yvonne tailors solutions to help companies be more authentic, for employees to become the most successful, whole, and happy version of self. So we are delighted today to have Yvonne join us, and we will look forward to learning more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the role she's playing to help companies now with the newly formed business that she started after leaving corporate life, and already has several clients under contract. So isn't it great that she's doing so well independently and making a difference and helping to discuss this very timely topic? And with that, Yvonne, it's all yours. Take it away, my dear.
Well, thank you so much for having me today, Joyce and Vicki. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Vicki. I'm really happy to be here and to talk about this. I know that Joyce has quite a few questions for me, so I'm actually going to pass the mic to Joyce and allow her to fire away.
That's great. So first, just to set the stage, we want to go way back to where this all started with you and where your interest came from. But you talk about DEI, and we know now it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. But given everything that's been going on in the country and everything that even in our government and what we all experienced on January 6th and so on, there seems that underneath this is a whole issue of trust. And so with that in mind, would you just educate us and let us know from your perspective, help us understand your perspective of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And if you can just break each of those components down for us, and then we want to start and learn about you and your journey in this whole realm.
All right, sounds like a great starting point. So I would say in the simplest form, diversity in itself is really about recognizing and respecting everyone's unique qualities and attributes. So we all have that within ourselves. And from the standpoint of equity, that's really about the fair and respectful treatment of all people. And then inclusion is how we as individuals should be able to feel respected, accepted, and valued. So that's really it in a nutshell. Without diversity, equity, and inclusion, what you get is really a homogeneous workplace, communities, and society where everybody thinks the same, everybody feels the same, they all look at things from the same perspective. So without diversity, equity, inclusion, you get very little innovation. A lot of organizations have problems with problem solving. There's no expansion of thought. There's limitations on business opportunities. And then as it relates to the workforce, when there isn't diversity, equity, and inclusion present, folks definitely feel the impacts of that. People feel like they can't bring their whole selves to the workplace. And that oftentimes gets reflected in attrition. It gets reflected in retention problems for the organization. And then obviously, without diversity, equity, inclusion in the broader construct, we see the impacts of society. And without getting into the political aspects of it, we certainly saw a lot of that come to a head back on January 6th with what happened at the US Capitol.
Got it. Okay, great. That's a good foundation. And a lot of us, I'm letting people in. There's more people coming in. So, and also there's a couple questions that were sent in, and I'm even seeing a couple that people have texted me in the last few minutes saying, I can't be there, but make sure you ask this, or she talks about. So we'll make sure that all this again will fit in sometime in the next half hour or so. But let's go back to where this all started with you. Where did you spend your childhood? And were some of these interests beginning to form at that time, or was this an unknown area to you way back when? So where did it begin? Where did you grow up? And what were your interests at that time?
Sure. I grew up in Middletown, Connecticut. I actually grew up to parents who worked. They were blue collar workers. They did not have advanced education outside of high school. I grew up rather in public housing. And so there were very limited resources. And I think as a lot of people viewed it, limited opportunities. But my parents always championed college, really as a means towards getting out of poverty. So I did pretty well in high school, and I also read a lot. Books became an amazing escape for me, and I found myself really loving Nancy Drew, and really like the old school ones, right? So you remember the ones with the yellow cover, and the covers were very stylized and artistic. I used to actually, I'm such a nerd, I actually used to request them for Christmas gifts. And I think now that I'm older, when I look back on that, I believe it was really the mysteries and the circumstances and the approach to solving an issue or problem solving overall that really was the reason why those books piqued my interest. So I was a bit of a bookworm.
Okay, so now move on, and you're in high school, college, etc. Talk about your schooling and majors that you selected, experiences you may have encountered either in higher grades or in college that may have either piqued your interest or sparked other thoughts regarding this whole field.
Yeah, so I would say growing up in high school, I grew up in the 70s. And so at that time, there really was still not a lot of acceptance for, a lot of races, certainly interracial relationships, as well as others. And for me to be such a fair-skinned Black woman, I did experience quite a bit of racism. And I would say, on the white side of things, you know, me looking a little bit different, not being as dark as some of my other counterparts. I was definitely viewed a particular way, my nose, my hair texture, those kind of things. So it wasn't really accepted on that side of the aisle, if you will. And then within the Black community itself, there was a lot of hesitation and concern around my lightness and favoritism, and what we call it within the Black community, colorism, that really does have its roots in systemic racism that goes back to the days of slavery, and the lighter or the fairer Blacks, the interracial Blacks, having the opportunity to live in the house and to be treated differently from those who were out in the fields. And so I really found myself very confused, very frustrated, in how society saw me and how they were reacting to me without really knowing me. And then I think also growing up in public housing, and just kind of looking around me, I saw a lot of the disparities that were going on, the socioeconomic, the wealth, the health disparities that resulted from socioeconomic conditions. And so those really had me thinking about, at that time, I would say going into law. So I was very fortunate. I did pretty well in high school, and I was able to get an academic scholarship to Quinnipiac. Back then it was Quinnipiac College, not the university that it is today. And I went there and I studied legal studies in English. I thought that I was going to go on to law school, but then I was bitten, as I often say, by the marketing and communications bug, and ended up going that route instead. But even my time at Quinnipiac in the late 90s, it was really interesting because there was still quite a bit of racism, even there in Hamden, Connecticut, even though it sits right next door to New Haven, which is much more of a melting pot. Quinnipiac had a lot of racial issues, a lot of racial tension on campus. And some of that was further, I think, stoked by the economic differences between a lot of the students that existed there as well. So I had some pretty interesting, tough experiences. I think I had shared with you and Vicky about, you know, I remember being in the cafeteria at Quinnipiac, and there were these two white males kind of standing off to the side, and I could tell that they were discussing me. And I heard one of them say, you know, oh, you know, I wish I could ask her out. You know, I think she's really pretty. And the other one said, well, yeah, but you can't bring that home. And so I, you know, was very hurt. Thank God I had some ounce of maturity and integrity, and I knew who I was. So I did inform them very politely and pointedly that, you know, they couldn't bring me home because I wouldn't waste my time with either one of them. But it was an experience that, you know, I guess I could say in alignment with my company, really left an indelible mark. And so it became kind of the start of, you know, my really wanting to make a difference for people from different communities, and certainly Black and Indigenous people of color.
This is so incredibly valuable, Yvonne, for so many reasons, because there are many of us who are in a number of different organizations, want to have these conversations, but don't know how to launch it. And that's why I'm even noticing in the little chat box on the side, if you haven't activated, if you just click chat, there's just some valuable side comments being made and conversations going on that we can embellish, learn more about later, or get into later. But I just want to thank you for your willingness to have this kind of an honest dialogue, because this is where it all starts, and it's what we should all be doing.
Yeah.
So just thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so now, so you're out of college, and now you're in you launched your career. So how did this whole DEI interest, and I don't know if they called it wherever you worked, but how did the whole interest get started, and what happened as the professional now wherever you were working?
Okay, so I went in working in the field of marketing communications for various organizations. At one point, I was at Sullivan and Cromwell in New York City, which is one of the Big 10 law firms. I worked for NASDAQ for a while as well. And my last couple of corporate jobs were in the insurance industry. And so in those roles, I always supported the employee resource groups or the business resource groups within those organizations, and especially in the DEI space. And so that's where I kind of really got bit by the DEI bug. And I did a lot of work over the course of many years off of the side of my desk for those organizations. And that included working with them on their marketing and communications, giving some talks. I also helped to develop some pipeline programs as well that really helped to put some of the BIPOC individuals front and center stage with some of the leaders, give them opportunities to make sure that they had seats at tables to meet with higher level executives who perhaps they wouldn't have opportunities to engage with otherwise, so that executives got an opportunity to see some of the talent within the organization that they may not have considered otherwise. And from that, there were mentorships and sponsorships built. I know that there were a couple of individuals that were actually brought onto teams. And so it really was about making sure that people who maybe were not seen prior to had the opportunity to be seen by leadership and to present to leadership their inherent value to the organization, not just its culture from the respective diversity alone, but also the intellectual value that they had to the organization.
Do you see that changing now, like in the last couple of years, or do you see pretty much same old, same old?
I think it's evolving. I would say, you know, the murder of George Floyd this past summer put race and diversity, equity, and inclusion not just on the front burner, but a pot boiling over, as I would like to say. It's something, that situation and the fact that it was so televised and the media picked it up on a global scale really put it under people's noses in ways that they could not turn away. They could not no longer say that this isn't happening and this doesn't exist. And I think the outrage that we heard about and we saw on a global scale really has changed conversation. It's changing cultures within organizations. And I think it's also changing societal cultures. But even within that, there's obviously still a lot of resistance. And so we have a lot of work to do. But I do believe that change is on the way. And I'm just one person among many doing my part to hopefully make organizations better and to hopefully throw a rock in the pond and watch the ripples go out far and wide into society as well.
I think you are spot on with that. And we are, what, 20 on the call, and hopefully we will be going 20 different ways. And there's the ripple effect of change beginning to happen and then cascading out. You mentioned early on when we talked about community racism and bigotry. And I just wonder, would you talk a little about that? And then also on an individual level, what can people do? What can each of us do individually to begin to turn this around? I'm thinking things that we see, we notice, we say, we don't say. What do you notice and what can we do?
Yeah. So, I mean, you pick up any magazine, if we still do, you look online, you turn on any form of media, and you see that racism, unfortunately, is just rife right now. It's rife in communities and in workplaces and in society overall. We're very divided right now. There's a lot of hatred that, to be honest, I think has existed for a very, very long time and has always been there, but it's on the forefront now. And I believe as a result, you know, we can't turn a blind eye to it anymore. We have to deal with it. And so I think on an individual level, what we can do is we can be individually responsible for our bias. We can recognize that the fact is that we all have bias, whether or not you see yourself as having any issues with racism whether you consider yourself racist or not, we all have some form of bias, just like we all have some form of privilege, with the exception, and we can talk about in a little while the difference between privilege in its broadest definition and construct versus white privilege. But, going back to, you can check your bias. You can be looking at, why do you do or not do something, right? What causes you perhaps to, if we were to look at it through the lens of black and white, let's say, and you're walking down the street and you see a Black youth on the other side of the street, and for some reason you clutch your bag a little bit closer to yourself, or you get a little bit of flutter of discomfort. That's bias. And we have to face that, and we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And then we also have to start seeing people for who they are, and not who we think they are based on exterior factors or stereotypes, things that we've seen, things that we've heard, and even unfortunately sometimes things that have been passed down to us through generations. And where oftentimes, racism and bigotry, misogyny, all of these things, a lot of the isms, if you will, this is oftentimes where they are generated from. It's something that is learned behavior that gets passed from generation to generation. And sometimes people don't even realize why they think or feel the way that they feel. They don't even sometimes remember what the genesis was of it. But what's most important, I think now, while that is important, I would encourage people to say, okay, if this was something that was passed on, or even if I don't recall what the genesis was, I have agency over myself now, and I can do something about this. I can check my own bias and be responsible for my own bias and do my part to not engage in the same behaviors that promote racism or inequalities and inequities, or keep an organization or a community from being and feeling truly inclusive for all.
Got it. Okay. This is also so valuable. You mentioned misogyny and this whole thing. I assume in just working all the years you have in the different environments, have you experienced it personally? And in a little while, when we open it up, we would love to hear from others too, because I'm Jewish. I know I felt it. I wonder if you felt it, and just in our own ways, if we've experienced this, and what was the experience like for you, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that I've ever helped, when we think about misogyny, sometimes people start, into the extreme of like hatred of women. I have not experienced hatred of women, but I have, certainly experienced my share of misogyny and sexism. I want to say the first time was as a teenager working in a pizza shop. And I had a male manager who used to follow me into the storage freezer and make inappropriate comments. And I was probably 16 at the time. And I remember how impactful that was, and how frightened I was, and how angry I was that he thought that that was appropriate, that he thought he could because he was a man and I was a woman or a young girl. And so that was my first kind of introduction to that. And then throughout my career in office and corporate jobs, sure, definitely sexist comments. When I was working at one particular law firm, I used to wear pantsuits all the time because I'm fairly tall. I'm 5'9" and a half. I'm not afraid to wear heels. So I often wore pantsuits. And one day I was like, oh, I'm going to wear, a suit still, but a skirt suit. And there was this one senior attorney, and he came by, and one could say, he would always make off-color comments. So I shouldn't have been totally surprised. But he came by my office and he said, hey, and I said, hey, what can I do for you? And he goes, I came to see the legs. And I said, pardon me? And he said, I came to see the legs. They're talking about Yvonne's legs go on for miles. You got to check them out. And I thought, we are at a law firm, right? Like, this is illegal. And I just kind of looked around like, But
Yeah.
he was a senior partner. And I remember not feeling at that time fully empowered. And I stayed behind my desk and I said, nothing to see here. And I said, just same legs that so-and-so has at her desk and her desk and her desk and her desk. And I just looked at him and I said, I really need to get back to my cases. And I kind of just, so if you'll excuse me.
Good.
And so I just, those memories are, they're here, they're ingrained. But
Yes.
as I've become more clear on who I am, I've become much more, as I say, unapologetically authentic in my older years and much more wiser. I have no problem challenging comments now. And so I don't have any problem when things are said saying, I'm sorry, what did you mean by that? Just because I don't want to misinterpret. So, and go into, let them be accountable for the words that they say and let them know that that's not acceptable and that type of behavior and language is harmful. And so, it wasn't until I became just more mature and stronger to be able to kind of stand in my own space and stand up for myself to say what is acceptable and what is not. And I think that as women, we have, I dare say, a responsibility to do that, because I'm always thinking of the next generation that comes behind me. I think of my 16 and a half year old daughter and what I feel is my responsibility to hopefully make the world a better place for her. And should she decide or be able to have children, the generations that come behind her as well.
Got it. Okay. This is such valuable foundation for all of us to have this continued conversation. You mentioned earlier, and I want to go back to this whole issue of white privilege. What does that mean to you as a Black woman? And what should we all learn from this and then move forward and figure out?
Yeah. So before I, kind of jump into white privilege, I think let's first try to understand privilege in itself, right, on a base level. So privilege is really a special right, an advantage, or even sometimes an immunity that's granted or available to a particular person or a group. For example, heterosexual couples have the right to marry in all 50 states, and they always have, but not the same for same-sex marriage, which went from just one state in 2004 to all 50 states in 2015. And so that in itself, the right to marry, is a privilege. The ability to buy a home in a safe neighborhood, that's a privilege. The opportunity to attend college is a privilege. Access to good healthcare, technology, such as Wi-Fi and computers, believe it or not, that is a privilege. Having access to healthy foods, also a privilege. And so, we all have some level of privilege. Even as a Black woman, I have privilege where I grew up, being in public housing to where I am now as a middle class woman who lives in a safe neighborhood, who does have great health care, who does have buying power and an income that can support my family. Those are all privileges that I even possess. So it's important that we acknowledge that first. But then when we go into white privilege, and I heard what Vicki was saying earlier, and I think, Vicki, what you were referring to,
Right.
is the person had denoted to you that you had white privilege, not necessarily white supremacy, because
Right.
that's something on a whole nother level. But white privilege is really just the person's whiteness comes with an array of benefits and advantages that aren't shared by people of color. So, for example, going back to marriage, whites could marry one another, no problem there. It wasn't until 1960, up until I should say 1960, interracial marriage was still forbidden in 31 of the US states in 1960. And it wasn't until 1967 with the case of Loving versus Virginia, which was struck down, that banned interracial marriages as being unconstitutional. So there's that. When we look at the wage gap in America, so whites are just paid so much higher than Blacks. One statistics I have here from Lean In Organization reports that on average, Black women in the US are paid 38% less than white men and 21% less than white women, doing the same job, sometimes having the same education, if not more. Just that one wealth disparity, when compounded over time, over a family's lifetime, over a race, it's millions of dollars that Black communities, Black women, and in particular Black women, don't have, that their counterparts do when we are educated the same, when we're doing the same job, and we're working just as hard. And so there's that. There's also white privilege as it relates to having positive relationships with law enforcement generally. And we've seen this been played out in the media over and over again, where, sometimes when Black people are pulled over or other races are pulled over, there's this assumption of guilt, or that they're up to no good. There has to be concern for their own personal safety, and wondering if they're going to be able to, so to speak, drive away or walk away from that experience unharmed, let alone alive. There's privilege of learning about, race in school, where our, colonialism has been so normalized throughout our country, and through our education system, that it required a need for Black History Month, right? There's never been a White History Month, but there needed to be an intentionality to have Black History Month, to put some type of a focus on history for Black people and their contributions there too. So there are so many things that privileges that white people have that other races do not. And so that's really what's at the core of white privilege. And so what I would say is, if you are a person who, possesses white privilege, it's not necessarily a knock to you or making any assumptions that you have racist views or racist ideologies, or that you're not what would be considered an ally. But it really is about, how are you using that privilege to balance the scale? How are you using that privilege, knowing that it is a privilege? How are you using it to advantage those who are disadvantaged? And I think that's the bigger conversation that we need to be having from the perspective of white privilege. Because if I possessed it, my goal would be to, okay, so how can I help others who don't have it? How can I stand in the gap for them? How can I speak up to power and privilege in ways that, again, I guess I would say, just advantage those who don't. When I see something, I can say something. When I see injustice happen, I can say, whoa, whoa, whoa. Yeah, that's not okay. And that's how people can use their privilege, and in particular, white people can use their white privilege for good. And that's how we start to chip away at the systemic racism that we have in this country.
Okay, there's so many other questions, but I want to focus just on one for a second, and then let's open it up, because I want everyone to have an opportunity to question. When you're working in organizations, do you notice that people are so entrenched in their own beliefs, they can't hear what you have to say? And if so, how do you get around that, or how do you shift it so that you get more authenticity going in dialogue and doing exactly the things you were just talking about?
Yeah. So I would say that I start off by listening to understand, then to be understood. So that means that when I engage with people, different organizations, I'm really sitting back and listening to their stories, so that I can understand where they're coming from, their perspective, before I go in about sharing my own. I'm also very mindful of what may have caused them to have the perspectives that they have. If there is some bias present, whether it's not even race, maybe it's gender based, maybe it's based upon abilities. Maybe it's based on socioeconomic status. Whatever it is, I'm try to be mindful of what caused that. And sometimes I'll even ask them, what has helped to inform that perspective that you have? Where did that come from? I'm curious. And so that's a big part of it, is engaging with people from the standpoint of being genuinely curious about them, about their perspectives. And that's what oftentimes will open up the dialogue even more. And it starts to go from something that maybe initially is very distrustful to something that is much more authentic and real. And then when we can start to have those courageous, authentic conversations, we can start to get to the root of belief systems, why they exist. And then that's when I can go in and really just focus on the impact that I want to have for them, have on them, I should say. And then if it gets to the point where we, just can't agree, well, then I leave the conversation respectfully disagreeing, but always still leaving that door open to come back, to have the conversation again, or to have a different conversation.
Okay, that's great. So we agree to disagree and leave the door open. That's such good advice in and of itself.
Yeah.
Great. There's several others, but we're going to open it up now. So the questions that are coming in Sarah, you might want to, because that's a great one to talk about ageism. So have Yvonne think about that. And because I want to do, Sarah's asking, can you talk a little about ageism and specifically the misconceptions about older folks and how they impact interactions and how older folks can combat discrimination after retirement?
Okay. Woo, that's a lot. Thanks, Sarah. So I have to say that I often look at ageism. It saddens me because I think that it happens on both spectrums. I know that one organization that I've worked with in the past, it kind of came from both ends. You had this dynamic of younger people who did not respect the voices and the wisdom and the experience of the older generations in that workplace. And they had experiences that were so valuable to problem solving and looking down the pike and knowing potentially what the outcomes could lead to. And, you had these younger folks that were just like, oh, no, you don't know what you're talking about. And we've advanced beyond that. And they would just really kind of shut them down. And I thought, how silly of you. And then you had sometimes the reverse of that, where you had some of the more seasoned folks looking at the younger people thinking that, you don't know what you're talking about. You haven't lived long enough to really understand this or know this. And you're trying to just move too fast. And, I would even hear comments like, you're still wet behind the ears. What do you know? kind of things. And so I always try to encourage both sides that there's value in the knowledge. There's value in the life and the contributions anyway, but there's value in the experiences that both have had, both the young and the older. So we should really try to get to a place where we can learn from each other. And I think, Joyce, you and I touched on this a little bit ourselves when we were talking, and you were giving me some tips from your experiences. And we even talked about, hey, so when I have a question about XYZ, I now have a resource in you, Joyce, and a resource in you, Vicki. And so that's really great, and that's really important, and that's what we should be championing. And then, I'm sorry, what was the second part of Sarah's question? I want to make sure I hit both.
It was about the ability to combat the discrimination, once in retirement.
Yeah, and I think that as it relates to retirement, I think that I'm kind of old school, I guess, in this way, and so I believe wholeheartedly in taking care of and showing benevolence towards the older generation, those who have are before me. I would say that there's a lot of education that needs to occur in terms of interacting with older populations and how to engage with them in meaningful ways that allows them to, again, kind of showcase their value and to feel valued, to feel respected, to give them the dignity that they deserve. Whether it's in through the healthcare systems, whether it's in socioeconomic conditions, whatever it is, I think that we have a lot of work to do as a society for how we regard those that are aging. I would like to see us move to something well beyond where we are.
I have a question.
Okay, yeah.
According to the US Census, in 25 years, white people will be in the minority, and brown and black skins will be in the majority. Do you think that what we're experiencing now with the extreme white supremacy is as a result of this fear that they see a growing number of brown and black skinned people that is causing them in their biases to become more hostile?
Oh boy, you hit a nail on the head right there, Vicki. So what I will say is what in the conversations that I'm having and in my own learnings, in my own circles, which are extremely diverse across the board, what I'm hearing and what many people are experiencing is really about power and the fear of losing power and control. And so when you hear a lot about this, we're going to be kind of, if you will, upside down on the race dynamic in our country. And I wouldn't even say it's going to take 25 years from a lot of the stats that I'm seeing. We're seeing it in a lot of communities already across the nation. It's often said in the DEI world that it's not pie, right? So if I take a slice, there's nothing for you kind of thing. That's not this situation. We can all share in this globe. We can all share in this world that we have constructed together. And what has happened is because of colonialism and how it started so early with white privilege and white kind of dominating other cultures and societies. And that created the power structures that we have been built and layered through the years up until even today, that's what a lot of the fear is about. But I don't ascribe to, nor do I agree with the concerns about that, because as I said to someone the other day, I think some of the fear is, will Black and brown people do to us what we historically did to them? And I see Barbara shaking her head, Joyce shaking her head, Vicki shaking her head. Yeah. Well, Paul, hi. I see people shaking their heads like, yeah, that's a concern. And I will tell you that Black people are not a monolith. I can't speak for all of them, but here's what I will say in the conversations I'm having with family and friends and my networks. That's not who we are. That's not who we are. There's no interest in that. If anything, Black people historically and Black and brown people historically, understanding how marginalized that we have been for hundreds and hundreds of years, we want equality. We want equity. We want to be able to bring our whole selves to every part of this world and just live. We are not interested in persecuting, oppressing, or putting anybody under thumb. And you'd hear people say, like, it never even crossed my mind. I just want it to be fair. I just want to have opportunity like they do. That's it. That's it in a nutshell. And I see Terry shaking her head like, yes, that's it. And so I think the fear is misplaced, I would say. And I think, unfortunately, we didn't talk about the extreme other of white privilege, the white supremacy and the ethnocentrism. and the extreme views on single race and wanting that for our country. I think it's championed on that side, and I think that that has caused a lot of fanfare, if you will, around this concern of what is going to occur when whites become the minorities versus being the majority that they are now. But I dare say that a lot of it is factually unfounded.
Okay, Thelma, you got to unmute yourself, Thelma.
Miss Thelma?
I think this is so true, everything you're saying, Yvonne, and I have vicariously lived through some of your experiences in my long life with close friends growing up who experienced ridiculous kinds of discrimination that were it could be examined. But I think that what it is not so much fear. It's the fact that if you don't recognize that you have any privilege being white in this society, then what you're really fearing, you're going to notice that if it goes away, if there's equality, and if there isn't someone to look beneath you, to feel that there are people who are beneath you, and that somehow makes you feel strong, which is true among many segments of this population. That's where the real fear comes in. It's not that someone will do something to you that you've done to them, because you don't even recognize that you've done it to them. You don't even recognize that you've been in this position. And if you find out suddenly that there isn't someone to really look down on, which gives you, your ego, some status, I think it's as basic as that.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if that played a role. And I think that goes back, I feel like that's akin to the power dynamic, right? It really is about, like you said, being in that position to look down on puts you above. And putting you above is power of some sort. You have to have something or someone to subjugate. Yeah. And so that's actually a great insight.
The story of this scapegoat goes back to biblical times.
Yes.
And it's part of the human condition that shouldn't be.
Well, and that's why we need people like you speaking out about it and using your white privilege to educate others and to be an ally, which it sounds like, and maybe that wasn't a term that was used as you were coming along. But I dare say I wouldn't be at all surprised if you were an ally to others and trying to do your part to create opportunities for voices to be heard.
But the only way you really get to feel the way I think most people would get to feel the way I do is if they had the experience of living with other people and seeing what they were living through. So if they were in school with a best friend or someone who goes off to college and isn't able to room with her friends in a house approved by the university, because in the morning light, the landlady looks at the friend and says, "Oh, I couldn't tell last night. Are you a Negro?"
Wow.
And when my friend answered yes, she was told she couldn't stay there.
Wow. That must have been really impactful and hurtful for your friend, but also for you as being her friend.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm sorry you had that experience, but I'm really appreciative of you sharing.
That's what it takes. If people are living in all their silos and not with each other, they don't realize, they can't feel it.
Right. And so that's why it's important to go out and experience this big, beautiful, vast world. If you do live in a bubble, if you do live in a community that is predominantly looks like you, I think that you have a responsibility to broaden your horizons. I mean, for those of us that, all of us on this Zoom call have access to technology. We have access to a computer. So you can go on and you can watch movies that are about different cultures. You can talk to people from different races and ethnicities to find out, hey, what was your experience like? Sarah's saying individual relationships are the basis of social change. Absolutely, Sarah. And so it's really important that we take the time to broaden our own experience, broaden our own education. When you can go back to going to restaurants and it's, safe, try a different type of cuisine. Talk to somebody from a different race. Just say hello if you have a neighbor. Build a rapport. That's how we start to do this, little by slow, step by step. And we do it with one another and we walk this thing out with one another. And that's how we begin to chip away at systemic racism and this culture that has been created. I'm sorry, it looked like Barbara had a question.
Yeah, or Meg, also Meg, Barbara, and then Meg.
Thelma, thanks for raising this because I'm very interested, and you're magnificent, Yvonne. You touched me so deeply, and the sharing and the depth of your sharing really touches my heart. I understand a lot about trying to be an upstander and speaking out and creating systemic change around a lot of issues. And I understand when Thelma went the route of, we have to know people. But truthfully, I think we need something on a broader scale. When I was working in the Philadelphia school system, I was frequently the only white person in a room of people of color. And I loved that experience because A, I learned what it felt like to be the outsider, and B, I created wonderful friendships. I'm afraid that if this just evolves, catch as catch can, meeting people who are different from you, it's going to take forever. And I wanted to pick your brain and look at, can we put in place scenarios or situations where people mingle more than they do? Because our comfort level tends to be with our people that we live with, that we socialize with, that we work with, but it's not diverse. And I'm concerned that if we don't put in institutions or protocols that have people really meeting each other for other reasons, because I was in a group last week and I was supposed to call a Black friend and go over this Harvard questionnaire with them on racism. And I candidly could not think of someone right now to reach out to. And that bothers me. So how do we really create opportunities to be with diverse populations? Because we tend to stick to our own.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a hard thing right now, obviously, with COVID, to do that. But just even thinking about this dynamic right here, this is one step right here, you being a part of this. You can go on to different forums and you can talk to different people. You can jump on webinars. There's so many webinars out here on race and trying to bring people together. And I understand that, a lot of this stuff right now lives on social media. But if you have people who, if you're not social media savvy, and this goes to age, right? So I refuse to assume that anyone on this call is not social media savvy, because you could be savvier than me. But if you are not, have someone else show you how to sign up for some talks and things like this, opportunities to meet people from different areas of life. But I think once we're back into broader society, I think you can go where the people are. I had a friend of mine recently that they were looking for a house. And so they were looking for a house in here in Connecticut. There's a town called Avon, Connecticut, which is fairly wealthy, and it is not extremely racially diverse. And so my friends who are white went to their realtor and she said, okay, well, let me show you this, and this house. And then my friend said, wait a minute, before you show me these houses, I have a question for you. Is it a racially diverse neighborhood? And the real estate agent said, I'm sorry, pardon me? And my friend said, is it racially diverse? And she said, is that a concern of yours? And the husband said, yes, it is. And she's like, oh, okay. She said, well, the houses where I was going to bring you were predominantly white. And he said, exactly. And that's what I wasn't looking for.
Wow.
And he said, my wife and I intend to have children, and we want them to understand what the world should look like. And we do not want to limit their experience. So please do not show us any houses in Avon, Connecticut, where the environment, the neighborhood is predominantly white. I know that's going to be a little bit of work for you, but you're going to earn your commission. So let me know. We're going to cancel today because none of those houses are what we're really looking for. And you may even want to consider putting that as part of your questionnaire when you meet new clients to say, is this something, are there things like this that are important to you? So even in that one step, I use that as an example. And that's something that a lot of us wouldn't think about. I see a lot of you on the call, like shaking your heads or saying, wow, that's not something I would have thought of. These are the things and the steps we can take. There is not a one size fits all that we can I wish I could like throw it out in the universe and everybody just woke up and was like, I am accepting of all other races and creeds and ethnicities and ages, and we are just a DEI melting pot of society. I wish I could, but since I can't, it's on an individual level. So as we all do our parts and as we all socialize this information, as we all have these such important conversations and get more courageous with them, that's how we can continue to make an impact. So you, Barbara, and you, Thelma, and you, Wendy, and you, Linda, and all of you on this call, start throwing rocks in the pond. Start having these types of conversations and be fearless. Use your privilege in whatever forms and fashions that you have it. Use it to create a better world and to challenge the systems as they exist so they'll be less oppressive and more inclusive.
That's great. Okay, well, I'm looking at the time, and Meg, we have time for one more question. So you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. First of all, I came in late, and second of all, I think the thing I was going to say is no longer really the thing I want to say, but here's what I want to say, Yvonne. I have been blown away by who you are and what you're saying. And I find, and I'd like your impression of this, I don't know exactly how old you are, but I have found and believe that the younger generation is coming in to their lives with a more egalitarian, evolved way of looking at things. And I just know so many young people that I think are so much ahead of where we were in our youth. And I wonder if that's your impression.
I think it's a different perspective. I think that this generation, and I'm not that young, but you're so kind to say so. I do really good spackle and paint, like really, really good. I am very fast approaching 50. Very, very.
No kidding. Oh my gosh.
I really am.
Wow. All right. Well, how about the 20s and those guys?
Oh, I think that I think it's interesting, right? There's some thoughts around and kind of stereotypes regarding like millennials and that they don't care about certain things and they're just really fast on the draw and but that they are very much tapped into a lot of the ills that are going on in society and wanting to solve for them. I think the differences are, and I will say this and probably somewhat to my own detriment, is the thing that I love about your generation, and I know it differs for all of you, but the more seasoned generation, is I would like to say is a level of commitment. to things like this. When I think back to Martin Luther King, John Lewis, those who came before us that were literally willing to have their lives taken from them for this cause, it was a different type of passion. It was a different level of sacrifice versus sitting behind a computer screen and saying things or posting on social media. You know, while I understand the progression of technology and the advantages of that to reach a broader audience as a result, I also sometimes do not see the same level of commitment. So I think, you know, it kind of goes back to that statement earlier on where we could all learn something from each other. I think that, but I do think that this generation certainly has, Sarah, this generation certainly does have the advantage from a technological standpoint, but your generations have the advantage of living it in such an overt way. It was so blatant, it was so in your face, that those who were standing up were standing in the face of danger for it, to be on that side of things. And it just feels different to me. It feels different to me, and it's very empowering. It's very encouraging. Like, I see all of you on this screen, and I am so honored that you would sit here and listen to this wet behind the ears girl talk about these issues, and say that you've learned anything, because like I said earlier, I think I could sit here and learn so much from you all. So I hope that you guys get the opportunity to experience that give and take that you deserve.
Well,
Thank you. But could I just also reference the amazing Black Lives Matter movement?
Yes.
And they're out there on the front lines.
Yes, and they are out there on the front lines, and I appreciate that so much. I think, unfortunately, a lot of times they get a bad rap as being more of a political organization, and that they're intentionally trying to be divisive. And I don't think that that is true of the whole, just like anything else. You know, nothing is a monolith, right? Like, nothing is in totality this. So I do applaud their efforts, and I would encourage those of you who don't know much about them to learn more about them, and really what they're saying, that they're not saying that all lives don't matter, white lives don't matter, blue lives don't matter. What they're saying is that as being treated by society, Black lives haven't mattered. And they're standing up and saying, we are here and we want to live. So please, when you look at us, allow my life to matter to you. That's what it's all about. My life needs to matter as much as yours and yours and yours, rather than it being so quickly gunned down, so quickly invalidated, so quickly to be snuffed out in some form or fashion.
Yeah, Wendy just put in the chat room, and it's so true. The way you just worded that is really a takeaway all of us need to have, and it is about everyone matters, and allow us to matter. This is great. Now, two things you said. First, about the ongoing dialogue. As we move into the new My Future Purpose membership organization, 2 evenings a month. And it happens to come up on February 4th, which is a Thursday from 4 to 5. Yvonne has offered to make herself available to continue the dialogue. And so we are going to start our first session with this particular topic in just a no formal program, but just a way to absorb today, and then bring your comments, thoughts, questions, concerns, and we will continue the dialogue. And so, Yvonne, from all of us, we just want to say thank you. And we look forward to continuing it in 2 weeks.
Yes, thank you all for having me. Wendy, I know I didn't get to your question, but it's in the chat. And if you want to connect with me, reach out to Vicki or Joyce and we can email and dialogue about it. But I want to make sure that you get your question answered.
And we always say this is the end, so we'll say goodbye. But if anyone wants to hang out at the bar is now open. Bring your own and we're going to continue. So bye, everybody.